It's not uncommon at all for many people to interpret the effects of doomerism or the black pill as simply depression. It's something you hear quite frequently. People will say, well, if you're black pilled, you're just clinically depressed. And I'm not going to entirely dispute that claim, which is to say, yes, there's a lot of depression in the black pill, and there's also a lot of depression in doomerism. But how you arrive at certain stages of life, states of being, is, I would argue, just as important as the state itself. That's not universally true, but more often than not, it is true. So to simply make the statement that somebody who is black-pilled or doomerism-pilled, or any combination of both, that this person is simply depressed, or very depressed, or clinically depressed, doesn't give you the whole story. And there's a reason for that, because the end result to some degree might be the same, but the causation, this concatenation of events, tells a very different story than the end result of a quote-unquote depressed individual. Because all sorts of people can become depressed. That is why there is a booming industry in therapy, and even online therapy, as well as pill pushing, such as the pushing of SSRIs, which can be good or bad depending on your perspective. I don't really have a strong opinion on them, to be honest. But if depression weren't a thing, no one would talk about it, yet it's a very common phenomenon. Arguably, mental illness for years now, if not decades, has been on the rise. So, yes, I would not dispute that depression is a factor that is a result of the quote-unquote black pill, but how does one get there? Typically, and this is something that I expatiated on quite a bit in my video on doomerism with my Bob and Tom story, typically normies, normal people who become depressed, have something not work out in their lives in a very specific way. It's not always the case, but very frequently. But the grand narrative of their lives, the story they tell themselves, is one that is oftentimes remarkably consistent. They have certain goals in mind. They have certain things they want to achieve. They have a job they do, friends and family. All these things make sense to them. What doesn't make sense to them oftentimes is their state of depression, their moods. These things don't make sense to them. Or maybe one element is missing. Maybe everything is fine, but the job isn't that great, and so they become depressed. And oftentimes they might see a therapist. And what will the therapist do? Typically, they might say something as simple as change your job, which isn't always something patently obvious to each and every individual, least of all people suffering from depression. But the kinds of things that bother quote-unquote normal people are typically not the kinds of things that bother people who are doomer or black-pilled. Because ultimately, we're talking about two different schemas or narratives. There's a broad general narrative within the context of society, and it goes something like, you should work hard in school, get a job, be a contributing and productive member of society, yada, yada, yada. Maintain friendships, pursue relationships, live a good and fulfilled life. And it sounds great on paper, but the problem with this narrative for many individuals is that the narrative itself is tissue thin. It is transparent. It's not accurate. It's not giving these people a precise depiction of reality as they see it. And so that's the narrative. And this is an important point to make, because as long as you're operating with a normative narrative, that everything presented to you thus far in your life is good and true and functional, then you're not going to have that many issues. And if something falls out of whack, such as you finding the wrong job, or a particular relationship not working out, or a weight issue, whatever it might be, within the framework of the conventional narrative, there is something you can do. You just readjust, because the narrative itself is true. And so that kind of depressed person will probably be aided and abetted by conventional tips. But however you arrive at a quote-unquote black pill state of mind, or a doomer state, maybe because you didn't win the genetic lottery, maybe you only partially won it, but even partially winning it, you've seen through the tissue-thin facade of the grand narrative that everything is fine and everything presented to you is something worth pursuing and achieving. Maybe you did go to school and university. Maybe you did work as a wagey, pursue relationships, and even then, it all seemed hollow. What comes after that? Because the grand narrative that we're told, which I have to say I think is necessary to a large degree to maintain a coherent society, well, that does not sync with any revelation you might have going forward after you've realized certain things or recognized certain things to be false. And over time, these revelations can turn into what is conventionally called depression, dissatisfaction, a problem with the humors, however you want to frame it. It is not necessarily dissimilar to the depression a quote-unquote normal person might feel or sense, but how one gets there is instrumental, because in terms of quote-unquote normal conventional depression within what I refer to as the grand narrative, there are things that can help you, tools that can aid you. You'll get what is frequently referred to as a blue pill pep talk of the things you need to do with your life and how to approach them. Not so with a person who arrived at this state for different reasons. For example, most therapists are female. What is a middle-aged female therapist going to tell a 20-something-year-old male who has seen through the facade of the grand narrative, who is endlessly ranting about lookism and the ultimate futility of everything he does? Not very much. That's part of the problem, functionally speaking, with the black pill doomerism. And it's a valid complaint. There aren't too many solutions. Within a normie/normal framework, you just send a person to a therapist. You tell them to pop some antidepressants, and that's it. Because he at least nominally still believes in the grand narrative of conventional society. But that doesn't really work on the doomer/black pillar. And so these ideas, these prescriptions about, well, if you're black-pilled, you're just depressed, well, that only tells you part of the story. How did you get there? That's very, very important. Because part of what distinguishes you, if you're that individual, from everybody else in that same state of mind, which is to say a depressed state, is you don't really believe the poppycock anymore, the narrative you've been told. It's impossible to believe because you've been connecting the dots, you've been piecing together the evidence. Everything conventional in terms of quote-unquote treatment of your depression will fail. Well, maybe some kind of drug or antidepressant might work, but to what end? So you can function within the narrative? That's at best a band-aid, not a solution. And all this rather well illustrates the distinction between people that arrive at similar states, because how you get there is relevant in how you are going to address the issue. Frankly speaking, at this current point in time, we do not have a good means of addressing the kind of depression that is brought about by an intense preoccupation with the black pill or doomerism, with having seen through the facade of the grand narrative of how things are supposed to be in the world, and the fact that you're supposed to find joy in these things even if you don't. No, people who think that way are regarded as outcasts and freaks. So clinical depression or not, there doesn't seem to be a good solution anywhere within the normal parameters for individuals of this type. So just imagine my friend Ainsworth that I recently talked to, who, if you listen to, questions everything. What sort of benefit would he receive from a therapist telling him normie perspectives, normie points of view, when he calls everything into question? Or even a person who's just obsessed with lookism. Let's say this person is not very attractive. Is he really going to believe the platitudes fed to him subsequently if he sees a therapist? That he should just try hard and be a nice person? Probably not. In fact, it's very worrisome to me and others that there is no particularly good solution to this black pill / doomerism induced depression. But pretending that conventional means and methods are going to help, conversely, I think is either dishonest or just born of a misunderstanding of just how deep the rabbit hole goes and how grim the situation actually is. Everyone, thanks for tuning in. Please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button.